The USS Indianapolis was the ship that delivered the atomic bomb to end World War II. But that same secret mission became her death sentence. Because 72 years later, when they finally found her on the ocean floor, the discovery revealed something that changes everything we thought we knew about America's greatest naval disaster. What those 316 survivors went through in shark-infested waters. Well, that's a story that'll make you question whether winning the war was worth what happened next. See, everyone knows about the atomic bomb. Everyone knows about Hiroshima. But nobody talks about the ship that made it possible. Nobody talks about how 200 American sailors became casualties of their own government secrecy. Nobody talks about how the Navy let 879 men die in the water and then spent decades covering it up. The USS Indianapolis wasn't just sunk by enemy torpedoes. She was murdered by classified stupidity. And when Paul Allen's team found her wreck in 2017, sitting 18,004 feet down in the Philippine Sea, they didn't just discover a sunken ship. They discovered evidence of one of the biggest military cover-ups in American history. You think you know this story? You think you know what happened to those men floating in shark-infested waters for 4 days, while their own Navy forgot they existed? Trust me, you don't know anything yet, because what really happened to the Indianapolis is so much worse than the official version. And the proof has been sitting on the ocean floor for 7 decades, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. But to understand why this ship disappeared into legend, you need to know what she was really carrying, and why that cargo sealed the fate of every man aboard. The Indianapolis wasn't just any warship. She was hand-picked for the most classified mission in American history. While everyone thought she was heading to routine patrol duty, she was actually racing across 5,000 miles of ocean with 40% of the world's enriched uranium locked in her hull. This wasn't some routine supply run. Think about it. You've got a 610-foot heavy cruiser, launched back in 1931, that spent the early war years as President Roosevelt's personal yacht. She'd cruise around South America on goodwill tours, host diplomatic parties, basically play floating White House. Then suddenly, in July 1945, she's loading mystery crates in San Francisco, under armed guard, and nobody's talking about where she's going or what she's carrying. The Indianapolis had been fighting across the Pacific for years by then. Tarawa, Kwajalein, the Philippine Sea. She'd earned her stripes in blood and steel. 9 8-inch guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and a top speed of 32 knots made her a floating fortress. But speed was what mattered now, because what they were loading onto her deck was going to change the world forever. But what they loaded onto that ship in San Francisco wasn't just going to change the world. It was going to damn every soul aboard her. 2 Army officers guarded mystery crates that contained uranium-235 and components for Little Boy, the bomb that would obliterate Hiroshima. The mission was so secret that even the ship's captain didn't know what he was carrying. They made the 5,000-mile journey to Tinian Island in record time, just 74.5 hours from Hawaii. No escorts, no backup, no one knowing where they were. Picture this scene. It's July 16, 1945, and Indianapolis is docked in San Francisco. Longshoremen are loading regular supplies, food, ammunition, spare parts. Then these Army guys show up with a truck convoy and armed guards. They're wheeling these wooden crates up the gangplank, and nobody's allowed to ask questions. The crates go straight into the ship's hangar, under 24-hour guard. Captain Charles McVeigh III asks what's in the crates. He's told it's classified above his security level. The ship's executive officer asks. Same answer. Even the Marine guards posted outside the hangar don't know what they're protecting. All they know is if anyone gets too close, they've got orders to shoot first and ask questions later. So the Indianapolis leaves San Francisco with a cargo that could vaporize cities, sailing under radio silence toward an island most Americans had never heard of. Tinian, a tiny speck of land in the Marianas. that had become the world's largest airbase. That's where the B-29s were taking off to bomb Japan into submission. And that's where the Indianapolis was delivering the ingredients for the ultimate weapon. The uranium alone was worth more than the entire ship. 40% of all the enriched uranium-235 that existed in the world was sitting in her hangar. Plus components, plus triggers, plus all the other pieces that would be assembled into Little Boy. The bomb that would kill 80,000 people in a flash of atomic fire. And exactly when this nightmare began, nobody saw coming. See, here's what the government never wanted you to know. That secrecy killed those men. Because when Indianapolis left Tinian after delivering the atomic components, she sailed into waters where Japanese submarines were hunting. And since her mission was classified, nobody was tracking her route. Nobody was expecting her arrival. Which means when she disappeared, it took 4 days before anyone even noticed she was missing. 4 days of men dying in the water while the Navy had no idea where she'd gone. This is where the whole thing becomes criminal negligence, dressed up as national security. The Manhattan Project was so compartmentalized that the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. The guys who planned the atomic mission didn't talk to the guys who planned naval operations. The guys who tracked ship movements didn't know about classified cargo runs. And the guys who monitored submarine threats. They weren't allowed to warn ships on secret missions. So you've got this perfect storm of stupidity. Indianapolis delivers the atomic bomb components on July 26, 1945. Mission accomplished. World War II is about to end. But instead of sailing home in triumph, she gets orders to report to Leyte in the Philippines for training exercises. Just routine duty after the most important mission in naval history. But here's the kicker. The route they gave her went straight through what Navy intelligence knew was Submarine Alley. Japanese subs were prowling those waters, making final desperate attacks before their country surrendered. And Naval Command knew it. They had intercepts. They had intelligence reports. They knew those waters were crawling with enemy submarines. But they didn't warn McVeigh. Couldn't warn him. Because officially, Indianapolis wasn't carrying atomic bomb components. Officially, she was just another cruiser heading to routine patrol duty. And routine patrols don't get special intelligence briefings about submarine threats. So Captain McVeigh sailed his ship and 1,200 men into a killing zone without knowing it was a killing zone. Because the same secrecy that protected the atomic bomb project was about to feed his crew to the sharks. What happened next makes this the deadliest shark attack in recorded history. And the most preventable naval disaster in American history. But the atomic cargo was just the beginning, because what came next turned the Philippine Sea into a feeding ground that claimed 879 American lives. And the reason it happened? That's where this story gets really dark. You think the atomic bomb was the most terrifying weapon in World War II? Wait until you hear what the ocean did to those men. Wait until you understand how their own government fed them to the sharks, and then spent decades lying about it. Because when you're floating in shark-infested waters at midnight, 5,000 miles from the nearest friendly port, watching your shipmates disappear one by one into bloody water, you start to understand something about the real cost of victory. You start to understand that sometimes winning a war means sacrificing your own people on the altar of military secrecy. And the men of the Indianapolis were about to become the most expensive sacrifice in American naval history. On July 30th, 1945, at 12:14 a.m., 2 Japanese torpedoes ripped through the Indianapolis like she was made of paper. The ship, all 610 feet of her, went down in 12 minutes. Nearly 200 men were suddenly fighting for their lives in pitch-black water. But here's the thing nobody prepared them for. Imagine you're a 19-year-old sailor from Iowa, sound asleep in your bunk 3 decks down, when the first torpedo hits. The explosion throws you out of bed and across the compartment. Emergency lighting flickers on, then dies. You're in total darkness, and the ship is already listing to starboard. Water is rushing in through holes you can't see, and you've got maybe 10 minutes to get topside before you're trapped forever. But that's just the beginning of the nightmare. Because the second torpedo hit the ammunition storage, and now the ship is breaking apart. The bow section is already underwater. The stern is rising into the air like some kind of steel monument to disaster. And everywhere around you, men are screaming, praying, and trying to find their way to the deck in the dark. Captain McVeigh is on the bridge, trying to send out an SOS signal, but the radio equipment is destroyed. The ship's communication systems are dead. Even if he could call for help, the message would never get through. And in 12 minutes, 610 feet of American steel disappears beneath the waves, taking 300 men with her. The sharks were already circling before the ship even finished sinking. About 900 men made it into the water alive, but they had almost no lifeboats and no way to signal for help. The Philippine Sea is home to oceanic white-tip sharks and tiger sharks, and they can smell blood from miles away. Survivor Edgar Harrell described schools of hundreds circling beneath them. Men would disappear without a scream. Others went mad from drinking salt water and swam down toward the sharks, thinking they saw rescue ships. Here's what really happened in those waters. The Indianapolis went down so fast that only a handful of life rafts made it off the ship. Most of the men ended up floating in life jackets, or clinging to whatever debris they could find. Wooden crates, pieces of decking, potato nets, anything that would keep them above water. But the blood in the water was like a dinner bell for every predator in the Philippine Sea. Oceanic white-tips started showing up within hours. These aren't your typical coastal sharks. These are deep-water hunters that can grow up to 12 feet long and weigh 400 pounds. They've got massive jaws and absolutely no fear of humans. Edgar Harrell, a 20-year-old Marine, spent 4 days floating on a potato crate watching these monsters circle his group. He described sharks with dorsal fins cutting through the water like submarine periscopes. Men would be talking 1 minute, gone the next. Just empty life jackets floating in bloody water. And the worst part, some men went crazy from drinking seawater and started swimming toward the sharks thinking they were rescue boats. The hallucinations from dehydration made them see ice cream parlors floating in the waves, luxury hotels on the horizon, their dead shipmates calling them down into the deep. Adolfo Shalaya described watching men tear off their life jackets and dive toward the bottom, convinced they were swimming to safety. Others started fighting each other over fresh water that didn't exist. Some committed murder over drops of water from the morning dew. And remember, nobody even knew they were missing yet. This is where that atomic secrecy becomes mass murder. For 4 straight days, these men floated in shark-infested waters while the Navy thought Indianapolis was still sailing to her destination. Men shared drops of water, held each other up when the hallucinations started, and watched their friends get pulled under. Some committed mercy killings to end the suffering. Captain McVeigh tried to hold his men together even as command failures, his command failures they'd later claim, left them all to die. But what really happened during those 4 days of hell? And why did it take a chance sighting by a patrol plane to finally find them? The truth is even worse than you think. Because Naval Command in the Philippines was expecting Indianapolis to arrive at Leyte on July 31st. When she didn't show up, they just assumed she'd been delayed by weather or mechanical problems. Ships were late all the time. Nobody bothered to check. Meanwhile, Naval Command in Guam thought Indianapolis had already left their jurisdiction. They'd handed off responsibility to the Philippines, so it wasn't their problem anymore. And Naval Command in San Francisco? They thought she was safely delivered to her destination and operating under Philippine authority. So you've got 900 men dying in the water, while 3 different Navy commands each think somebody else is responsible for tracking them. It's like a deadly game of telephone, where the message never gets through. The men in the water organized themselves into groups. Captain McVeigh's group had about 50 men. Other groups had anywhere from a dozen to several hundred. They tried to stay together for protection, but the sharks kept picking off stragglers. Men on the edges of the groups would disappear during the night. By morning, the groups would be smaller. Some men lost their minds completely. They'd start screaming about Japanese soldiers swimming up from below to attack them. They'd fight their own shipmates, thinking they were enemy spies. Others became catatonic, just floating motionless until they slipped beneath the waves. And through it all, the sharks kept feeding. Witnesses described the water turning red for hundreds of yards around each group. Body parts floating past. The smell of blood so thick you could taste it. But here's the most horrifying part. Some of the men who died weren't killed by sharks. They were killed by their own shipmates who couldn't stand to watch them suffer anymore. Mercy killings in the middle of the ocean, performed by teenagers who should have been worrying about high school dances instead of deciding which of their friends deserved a quick death. The rescue was just the beginning of a cover-up that lasted decades, because when those 316 survivors finally got pulled out of the water, they had stories the Navy didn't want anyone to hear. 316 men survived the sharks. But when they got back to dry land, the Navy needed someone to blame for the worst maritime disaster in American history. And the man they chose, his story will make you sick, because it's one thing to lose a ship to enemy action. It's another thing entirely to sacrifice your own captain to cover up your intelligence failures. And what they did to Charles McVeigh III proves that sometimes the real enemy isn't wearing a different uniform. Sometimes it's wearing the same one you are. The survivors knew the truth. They knew what really happened out there. But when they tried to tell their stories, they discovered that the Navy had already written a different version of events. A version where the disaster was one man's fault instead of a systemic failure that went all the way to the top. And for 23 years, that lie destroyed an innocent man's life. Captain Charles McVeigh III became the only U.S. Navy captain court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action during World War II. They blamed him for not zigzagging, a defensive maneuver that might have avoided the torpedo strike. But here's what the court-martial didn't mention. Naval intelligence knew Japanese submarines were in those waters and never warned him. Let me tell you about Charles McVeigh III. This wasn't some rookie captain who didn't know what he was doing. This was a third-generation naval officer whose father and grandfather had both served with distinction. McVeigh himself had commanded Indianapolis through some of the toughest battles in the Pacific. Tarawa, Kwajalein, the Philippine Sea. He'd proven himself under fire again and again. But more importantly, McVeigh was following direct orders from Naval Command when Indianapolis was sunk. The route he took, the speed he maintained, the radio silence he observed, everything was exactly what his superiors had told him to do. He wasn't freelancing out there. He was executing a mission plan that had been approved at the highest levels of the Navy. So when the torpedoes hit, McVeigh did everything right. He tried to send distress signals, though the radio equipment was destroyed. He got as many men off the ship as possible in the 12 minutes before she sank. He organized survivors in the water and kept them alive for 4 days until rescue arrived. By any reasonable standard, Charles McVeigh was a hero who saved lives under impossible circumstances. The Japanese submarine commander himself said McVeigh couldn't have avoided the attack. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who fired the torpedoes from submarine I-58, testified at McVeigh's trial that zigzagging wouldn't have mattered. He had a clear shot either way. But the Navy needed a scapegoat for their intelligence failures. McVeigh spent the rest of his life receiving hate mail from families who blamed him for their sons' deaths. In 1968, he shot himself in his front yard, clutching a toy sailor. The man was tormented for 23 years by a court-martial that should never have happened. Think about how insane this is. The Navy brought the enemy submarine commander to Washington to testify at an American captain's court-martial. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the man who actually fired the torpedoes that sank Indianapolis, told the court that McVeigh's tactics wouldn't have made any difference. He had the ship in his periscope crosshairs at 1,500 yards, an easy shot regardless of what evasive maneuvers the target was using. But the Navy wasn't interested in Hashimoto's testimony. They needed someone to blame for the disaster, and McVeigh was the perfect candidate. He was the captain, so he was responsible for everything that happened to his ship. Never mind that he was following orders. Never mind that intelligence failures put him in harm's way without warning. Never mind that communication breakdowns delayed the rescue for 4 days. The court-martial was a sham from the beginning. They charged McVeigh with hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag and failing to issue timely orders to abandon ship. The first charge was based on a standing order that said ships should zigzag in dangerous waters, but McVeigh hadn't been told the waters were dangerous. The second charge was ridiculous because Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes and McVeigh had gotten most of his crew off the ship. But the fix was already in. The Navy needed a scapegoat, and they'd found one. McVeigh was convicted on the first charge and received a letter of reprimand. His naval career was over. More importantly, his reputation was destroyed. And that's when the real torture began. Families of the men who died started sending McVeigh hate mail. They called him a coward, a murderer, a traitor. They blamed him for their sons' deaths and demanded that he be executed. Some of the letters contained death threats. Others included pictures of the dead sailors with accusations that McVeigh had killed them through incompetence. For 23 years, Charles McVeigh lived with that guilt. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares about men drowning in shark-infested waters. He'd receive hate mail at Christmas, on his birthday, on the anniversary of the sinking. Everywhere he went, people recognized his name and reminded him that he was the captain who lost the Indianapolis. In 1968, McVeigh couldn't take it anymore. He went into his front yard, put his service pistol to his head, and pulled the trigger. When they found his body, he was clutching a toy sailor, probably a reminder of all the men he couldn't save. The Navy finally exonerated McVeigh in 2000, but by then he'd been dead for 32 years. Think about that. They let an innocent man carry that guilt to his grave rather than admit their own failures. The real criminals were the intelligence officers who knew about submarine threats and never passed along the warnings. The communication failures that meant nobody reported Indianapolis missing. The rescue delays that killed hundreds of men who survived the initial sinking. But instead of taking responsibility, they destroyed one man's life and called it justice. Here's what really happened, and why McVeigh's court-martial was one of the biggest judicial frauds in military history. First, naval intelligence knew Japanese submarines were operating in the area where Indianapolis was sailing. They had decoded messages, radar contacts, and patrol reports that clearly showed submarine activity in the Philippine Sea. But this intelligence was classified, and McVeigh didn't have the security clearance to receive it. So he sailed into a submarine hunting ground without knowing it was a submarine hunting ground. Second, the Navy's own standing orders said ships could stop zigzagging in certain circumstances, including poor visibility, which Indianapolis encountered that night. McVeigh was following regulation when he ordered straight-line sailing. But the court-martial ignored this fact and blamed him for not zigzagging anyway. Third, the communication failures that delayed rescue weren't McVeigh's fault. They were systemic failures that went all the way up the chain of command. When Indianapolis didn't arrive at Lady on schedule, 3 different Navy commands thought somebody else was tracking her. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that killed 579 men through sheer incompetence. But admitting all this would have meant admitting that the Navy's intelligence services, communication systems, and command structure had failed catastrophically. It would have meant court-martialing admirals instead of captains. It would have meant taking responsibility for decisions made at the highest levels of military command. So instead, they blamed McVeigh. They turned him into a scapegoat for every institutional failure that contributed to the disaster. They let him carry the guilt for 879 deaths that weren't his fault. And when the pressure finally broke him, they let him die believing he was a failure and a murderer. The survivors of Indianapolis knew this was wrong. They campaigned for decades to clear McVeigh's name. They testified that he'd saved their lives, that he'd done everything possible under impossible circumstances, that he was a hero who deserved honor instead of blame. But it took until 2000 and a 12-year-old boys' school project to finally get Congress to pass a resolution exonerating Charles McVeigh III. 32 years too late. For 72 years, the Indianapolis kept those secrets buried in the deep. But the ocean has a way of preserving evidence that men try to destroy. And when Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen went looking for the truth, he found more than just a sunken ship. The Navy buried the truth, but the ocean kept the evidence. And when Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen went looking for answers in 2017, what he found on the seafloor changed everything. Including proof of something the survivors always claimed, but nobody believed. Because wreck sites don't lie. They can't be intimidated or court-martialed or driven to suicide. They just sit there in the dark, preserving the truth until someone brave enough to challenge the official story comes looking for it. And what Allen's team found 18,044 feet down in the Philippine Sea wasn't just the remains of a ship. It was a crime scene that had been waiting 72 years for investigators to arrive. On August 19, 2017, exactly 72 years after the rescue, Paul Allen's research vessel found Indianapolis lying 18,004 feet down in the Philippine Sea. The wreck was remarkably preserved. Guns still in position, the ship's bell intact, even personal effects scattered around the hull. But what Allen's team discovered down there tells a different story than the one the Navy has been selling for 7 decades. Paul Allen wasn't just some rich guy with too much time on his hands. The Microsoft co-founder was a serious World War II historian who'd been funding deep-sea expeditions for years. He'd already found the Japanese battleship Musashi and several other significant wrecks. But Indianapolis was special. This was personal. Allen's father had served in World War II, and Allen grew up hearing stories about the greatest generation and their sacrifices. When he learned about the Indianapolis disaster and the cover-up that followed, he decided to do something about it. He equipped his research vessel Petrel with the most advanced deep-sea technology money could buy. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, underwater cameras that could operate at crushing depths. The search area was massive, thousands of square miles of ocean floor in some of the deepest water on Earth. The Philippine Sea drops to over 34,000 feet in some places, and the currents had been moving debris for 72 years. Finding one ship in all that darkness was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Texas. But Allen's team had advantages the Navy didn't have in 1945. They had satellite navigation, computer modeling, and historical records that had been declassified over the decades. They could analyze the survivor accounts, plot ocean currents, and narrow down the search area to a few hundred square miles. On August 19, 2017, their sonar picked up something big sitting on the bottom at 18,044 feet. When they sent down the ROV cameras, they found Indianapolis lying upright on the seafloor, like she'd been placed there by gentle hands. Because the wreck reveals things the Navy never wanted anyone to know. The damage pattern shows the torpedoes hit exactly where the survivors said they did, not where the Navy claimed in their reports. The ship's position proves she was following orders, sailing the exact route Naval Command had authorized, and artifacts recovered from the site, letters, personal effects, pieces of equipment, confirm what the 316 survivors always insisted. They did everything right, and the Navy let them die through incompetence and cover-ups. The first thing that struck Allen's team was how well-preserved the wreck was. The cold, oxygen-poor water at 18,000 feet had protected Indianapolis like a time capsule. The ship's hull was intact. Her guns were still in their turrets, and debris was scattered around the impact site in patterns that told the story of her final moments. But more importantly, the physical evidence contradicted the Navy's official reports in several key ways. The torpedo damage was exactly where survivors had described it, forward and amidships, creating the catastrophic flooding that sank the ship in 12 minutes. But the Navy's court-martial records had placed the damage in different locations, supporting their claim that better evasive maneuvers might have saved the ship. The ship's orientation on the seafloor showed she'd been sailing on the exact heading specified in her orders from Naval Command. She wasn't off course. She wasn't freelancing. Captain McVeigh had been following his instructions precisely when the torpedoes hit. Most damning of all, artifacts scattered around the wreck site included pieces of communication equipment that proved the ship's radio systems had been destroyed in the initial attack. McVeigh couldn't have sent a distress signal even if he'd wanted to. The Navy's claim that he'd failed to call for help was physically impossible. The ROV cameras captured images of personal effects that had been scattered across the sea floor when the ship broke apart. Letters from home, family photographs, religious medals, wedding rings, the intimate possessions of men who died far from home while serving their country. Each artifact was a reminder that this wasn't just a military disaster. It was a human tragedy that had destroyed families and communities across America. But perhaps the most poignant discovery was the ship's bell, still hanging in its mount after 72 years underwater. The bronze had turned green with age, but the inscription was still clearly visible. USS Indianapolis, 1932. It was like finding the ship's voice, preserved in the deep. The wreck site had been designated a protected war grave, which meant Allen's team couldn't disturb the remains or remove artifacts. But they could document everything they found, creating a permanent record of the truth that the Navy had tried to bury. Because here's the most chilling discovery of all. The wreck site is now a protected war grave, which means those 879 men are still down there, still serving their country. And when you see footage of their ship, guns pointed toward the surface like they're still fighting, portholes staring up through 18,000 feet of dark water, you realize something. This isn't just a historical discovery. It's a resurrection of voices the Navy tried to silence. Every artifact they bring up, every piece of evidence the deep preserved, proves that the Indianapolis crew were heroes who got betrayed by the very country they died serving. The ocean kept their story safe when nobody else would. The Indianapolis wreck isn't just sitting on the ocean floor, it's standing guard over the truth. The ship lies upright, her bow pointed northeast toward the spot where her survivors were finally rescued. Her guns are still trained toward the surface, as if she's ready to fight one more battle against the lies that have surrounded her story for 7 decades. But what really gets to you when you see the footage is how peaceful it looks down there. After all the violence and terror of the sinking, after 4 days of men dying in shark-infested waters, after decades of cover-ups and court-martials and families destroyed by guilt and blame, after all of that, the ship finally found a quiet place to rest. The deep-sea cameras show fish swimming in and out of the wreck, like it's become part of the ecosystem. Coral has started growing on the metal surfaces. Nature has claimed Indianapolis and made her part of the seafloor, creating a living memorial to the men who died there. And that's fitting, because the ocean preserved things that the Navy tried to destroy. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even from 18,000 feet down. Every photograph from the wreck site, every measurement of the damage patterns, every artifact documented by Allen's team adds to the mountain of evidence that Charles McVeigh was innocent and the real criminals were never punished. The Indianapolis discovery wasn't just an archaeological triumph, it was a vindication. For the survivors who'd spent decades fighting to clear their captain's name. For the families who'd always known their sons died because of institutional failures, not individual mistakes. For everyone who'd refused to accept the Navy's version of events despite decades of official pressure to stay quiet. But there's something else the wreck reveals, something that goes beyond just this one disaster. The ship sits in water so deep that sunlight has never touched it. It's a world of eternal darkness where the only light comes from bioluminescent creatures that evolved to survive in conditions that would crush a human body in milliseconds. And yet, Indianapolis is there, preserved and intact, holding secrets that powerful people thought would never surface. That raises questions about what other secrets are down there in the deep places of the world's oceans. How many other ships carrying classified cargo have disappeared into the abyss? How many other crews have been sacrificed to protect government secrets? How many other cover-ups are waiting to be exposed by advancing technology and determined investigators? And that brings us to the question nobody wants to answer. The question that makes this story more than just a historical tragedy. The Indianapolis delivered the weapon that ended World War II. But was the price, 879 American lives, worth it? And what other secrets are still lying on ocean floors around the world? Because once you start digging into this story, once you understand how easily the Navy sacrificed these men and then covered it up for decades, you have to wonder what else they're hiding. What other disasters have been classified as national security instead of investigated as crimes? The deep ocean covers 71% of our planet's surface, and we've explored less than 5% of it. That means there are thousands of shipwrecks down there that we've never found, carrying secrets we've never uncovered, holding evidence of events that governments would prefer to keep buried forever. And in the age of autonomous underwater vehicles and advanced sonar mapping, how long before we find them all? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Indianapolis succeeded in her mission. The uranium she delivered became the bomb that hit Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Japan surrendered 9 days later. World War II was over. But those 8179 men paid for that victory with their lives, and not because of enemy action, because their own government secrecy and incompetence left them to die in shark-infested waters. Let's be brutally honest about what happened here. The Indianapolis completed the most important mission in World War II. The enriched uranium and bomb components she delivered to Tinian Island became the weapon that ended the war and saved potentially millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, would have been the bloodiest military operation in human history. The bomb worked exactly as intended. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, and 80,000 people died in a flash of atomic fire. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. From a strategic perspective, the Indianapolis mission was a complete success. The ship delivered her cargo on time, the bomb ended the war, and American forces began planning for occupation instead of invasion. The atomic bomb saved countless lives on both sides by making a bloody invasion of Japan unnecessary. But that strategic success came at a human cost that goes far beyond the 879 men who died in the Philippine Sea. Because what happened to Indianapolis proves that in modern warfare, victory isn't just about defeating the enemy, it's about what you're willing to sacrifice of your own people to achieve that victory. And that raises the biggest question of all about modern military operations and government secrecy. The bomb shortened the war and saved potentially millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. But the Indianapolis disaster shows the real cost of wartime secrecy. How many other ships disappeared into classified missions? How many other families never learned the truth about what happened to their sons? The wreck discovery in 2017 proves that the ocean preserves evidence better than government archives. Every deep-sea exploration reveals more hidden casualties of classified operations. Think about the math here. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was expected to cost 1 million American casualties and potentially 10 million Japanese casualties. Those numbers come from official military planning documents that were declassified decades later. The Pentagon was ordering Purple Heart medals by the hundreds of thousands in preparation for the invasion. The atomic bomb prevented that slaughter. In that context, the 879 men who died when Indianapolis sank were a small price to pay for ending the war. From a purely utilitarian perspective, trading 879 lives to save 11 million lives was the right decision. But here's what makes the Indianapolis tragedy different from other wartime casualties. These men didn't die fighting the enemy. They died because their own government secrecy protocols left them defenseless against threats their commanders knew existed. Naval intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, indicating submarine activity in the Philippine Sea. They knew Indianapolis was sailing into dangerous waters, but the classification systems were so compartmentalized that this information never reached Captain McVeigh. The very secrecy that protected the atomic bomb project also prevented him from taking defensive measures that might have saved his ship. And that's just the beginning of the systematic failures that killed those men. The communication protocols that meant nobody reported Indianapolis missing for 4 days. The bureaucratic confusion that left 3 different Navy commands thinking somebody else was responsible for tracking her. The rescue delays that killed hundreds of men who survived the initial sinking. Every one of these failures was predictable and preventable, but preventing them would have required admitting that classification systems designed to protect secrets could also get people killed. It would have required acknowledging that compartmentalized intelligence operations created dangerous blind spots in naval operations. The Navy couldn't admit that because it would have undermined the entire security apparatus that made the Manhattan Project possible. So instead, they blamed Captain McVeigh and classified the real causes of the disaster. They turned a preventable tragedy into a state secret and let an innocent man carry the guilt for institutional failures. But the ocean doesn't classify its evidence. The wreck of Indianapolis has been sitting on the sea floor for 72 years, preserving proof of what really happened. Every torpedo hole, every piece of damaged equipment, every artifact scattered around the impact site tells the true story that the Navy tried to bury. And as deep-sea exploration technology advances, we're finding more and more evidence of classified operations that went wrong. Ships that disappeared on secret missions and were never properly investigated. Crews that were sacrificed to protect government secrets and then forgotten by history. Because here's what really keeps me up at night thinking about this story. The Indianapolis isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. About what happens when governments prioritize secrets over lives. About how victory always comes with a price, and who ends up paying it. About how the dead don't stay buried when the truth needs telling. That wreck sitting 18,000 feet down isn't just a museum piece. It's evidence of crimes that were never prosecuted, cover-ups that destroyed innocent lives, and heroes who died forgotten. And if we're honest about it, how many more Indianapolis stories are still out there, still classified, still hidden in the deep places where only the dead know what really happened. The Indianapolis disaster reveals something fundamental about how modern governments operate during wartime. When national security is at stake, individual lives become expendable. Not just enemy lives, your own people's lives. Soldiers, sailors, civilians. Anyone who gets caught in the machinery of classified operations can be sacrificed without accountability, because dead men don't file Freedom of Information Act requests. Think about what we've learned from this story. A ship carrying the most important cargo in human history was sent into known danger without proper intelligence briefings, because those briefings might have compromised the secrecy of the mission. When the ship was sunk by predictable threats, the rescue was delayed for days because communication protocols prioritized security over human life. When the disaster was investigated, the real causes were classified, and an innocent man was scapegoated to protect institutional reputations. This isn't just historical negligence. It's a template for how governments handle inconvenient truths. Classify the evidence, blame individuals instead of institutions, and wait for everyone involved to die before the records are declassified. By the time the truth comes out, nobody responsible is still alive to face consequences. But technology is changing that calculation. Deep-sea exploration capabilities are advancing faster than government classification systems can adapt. Autonomous underwater vehicles can search vast areas of ocean floor without human crews. Satellite navigation and computer modeling can locate wreck sites with precision that was impossible just decades ago. Advanced cameras and sonar can document evidence at depths that were unreachable when these disasters occurred. The ocean is becoming transparent in ways that make old secrets impossible to keep. Every year, exploration teams find more shipwrecks, more evidence, more proof of events that governments prefer to forget. And unlike classified documents that can be destroyed or redacted, physical evidence on the seafloor can't be edited or sanitized. The Indianapolis discovery is just the beginning. There are thousands of ships down there carrying secrets that powerful people thought would never surface. World War II, submarines with classified technology. Cold War vessels on secret missions. Modern ships carrying cargo that their own governments don't want to acknowledge. And as we find them, as we document their stories, as we piece together the truth from evidence that's been preserved in the deep for decades, we're going to discover that the Indianapolis wasn't unique. She was just one example of a pattern that continues to this day. Governments sacrificing their own people to protect secrets, then covering up the crimes to protect their reputations. The 879 men who died when Indianapolis sank weren't just casualties of war. They were casualties of a system that values secrecy more than human life, that protects institutions instead of individuals, that would rather destroy innocent people than admit institutional failures. But their story didn't end when they died in shark-infested waters. It didn't end when Captain McVeigh was court-martialed and driven to suicide. It didn't even end when Congress finally exonerated him in 2000. Their story continued when Paul Allen's team found their ship 18,044 feet down and proved that the truth can't be buried forever. The Indianapolis is still out there, still serving as a memorial to the men who died and a monument to the truth that governments tried to hide. And as long as she's down there, as long as people are willing to seek out uncomfortable truths and challenge official narratives, the voices of those 879 men will continue to speak from the deep. Because some secrets are too important to stay buried. Some truths are too powerful to remain classified. And some prices are too high to pay for victory, even when that victory saves the world.